Welcome back to Razmavsar TV. I am very happy to have here Jim with me, and Jim is going to introduce himself, who he is, what he does, and about his background. First of all, Jim, welcome to Razmavsar TV channel.
Thank you very much, Dr. K. I appreciate that. I think I was going to try to say this correctly. I may not, but salam asbacher.
Yes, that's right. Salam asri. Very good, very good. Thank you very much. Could you please introduce yourself, who you are, please?
Yes, my name is Jim Emmons, and I am a historical fencing instructor in Oregon, USA, near Portland. I teach mostly late Italian, so 1850, early 20th century, but I also dabble in some other things as well. I find that all of the branches of the martial arts tree are related, and so I try as much as I can to incorporate other systems. Right now, that means I teach a little bit of small sword, French small sword, some late period bayonet against different weapons, against bayonet as well. And there's a group I'm working with sort of as an advisor to right now on Scottish broadsword. So,
oh, very interesting. Could you, Jim, please, before we go ahead, could you tell us about your educational background? Because I think I find it extremely highly interesting. I call you Jim. I know you have a doctorate, Dr. Emmons. Could you please tell us about your background, research background, and so?
Sure. I started out as an archaeology and classics student. So I did a lot of Latin, some Greek, and mostly on the art history, archaeology side. And then I went back to school and I got a master's in the ancient Mediterranean, focusing on the ancient world. And then I still wanted to get more. I really loved the topic. So I ended up majoring or finishing my doctorate in history. And the focus was early medieval. Some people call that late antiquity. So there's a lot of overlap because I was working around 600 CE. And it was just a dynamic time all around, pretty much everywhere. And my focus in particular was on early Ireland and the way in which literature from the Mediterranean influenced a specific type of religious writing there. The shorthand I give people normally is that when you're focusing on holy people and saints' lives, the stories about them are kind of like medieval comic books. They're fantastic, crazy things happen in them, but it still gives you some window into the world that those people lived in and some of the things they valued. That's research I continue to do once in a while. I just turned in an article this week. It's very short. But I've been very lucky. I taught for quite a while, and then I went back to school again to study manuscript curation and archives. And I worked in that field for a while, mostly in American history, which was very different for me, but I got a good crash course in education there. And those are all things that I'm applying more and more now to the history of fencing and martial arts.
Very interesting, very impressive. Could you please tell us a bit about the manuscript you studied before we go to your teaching of fencing and so?
Sure. Yeah, so for my doctoral research, I focused on one particular very enigmatic vita is what they call them, a life of this one saint. And his name is Ive McBrigg, which is hard to say in English, but I think the modern word for that is Hugh would be the name. Okay. And it's interesting because there are parts of the story that read like secular saga, where his brothers steal a woman that he planned to marry, and he's angry, so he collects his warriors and they go after the brothers. And on the way, he runs into a holy man who tells him that's not his path. So he gives all that stuff up and he goes and lives on his own as an ascetic. And of course, different people need his help. Other holy people want his help. And some of the things he does are fascinating. He reanimates people that have been dead, very, again, kind of comic book-like. He flies around forests in a chariot over the trees. Very, they're just hard to make sense of. And for a very long time, when scholars would look at these texts, either in Latin or Irish, they didn't know what to make of them. They're just strange. And so I looked at this one and sort of, where do these ideas come from? What do they mean? And so I looked both to the secular literature and to literature that would have informed these, like especially from France and parts of Britain. And if you look at them and kind of step back from the strangeness, these are all places where, you know, the holy person is acting on behalf of God, and they're helping people out, which is sort of the point of those stories. And they have a little entertainment value too, because people get sometimes tired hearing religious stories. And so, you know, if a saint is moving a swamp from one part of the country to another, people might wake up. At least that's how I look at it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very interesting. And Jim, have you ever analyzed also fighting manuals for as far as European or historical Western martial arts are concerned?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I spent most of my time on, say, 17th and 18th century, 19th century. But that said, when I first got involved with historical fencing, I was looking mostly at Fiore, and a little bit with the Walpurgis manuscript for sword and buckler. And being able to read Latin, that really helped. And I can read a little Italian. So with some good translations and some people who know Italian better than I do, there were parts of Fiore I started looking at. And I was really fascinated by especially with Fiore, how utterly medieval his presentation is. You know, it is not the way we would write a book today. And I think that's an important thing to realize as people looking at these manuscripts, that people are people, and they have been a very long time, but our way of processing information and presenting information changes. And I think that's one of those things that tends to get in people's way. And I've seen some very good interpretations of Fiore, but I think we also forget that this was a battlefield art, and there are things in there we shouldn't do, or people will get hurt. And so how do you share this corpus with them, you know, and teach people and yet keep them safe? And so that was one of the things that kind of drove me to look deeper into them and say, okay, well, how would they have trained this back then without breaking arms or teeth or something? So for the Middle Ages, I've spent the most on those two texts, that and 133. But then you know Mike Sherba, he showed me the Georgian buckler. And now I haven't really looked at 133 since. I really just focus on the Georgian stuff because it's so much fun. But for my most recent project, I've been looking at largely small sword texts, but also looking at rapier to analyze footwork. So the first one I looked at is Camillo Agrippa in 1553. And I've traced every text I could get my hands on. I've been looking at that down to like 1900. And I think I've read, 72 in the last year with quarantine. I've had lots of time. So, but yeah, I've been analyzing those and translating bits and pieces to write this study.
Could you please tell us why you were not, after you saw Georgian swordsmanship, you were not interested in 133 anymore? What was the reason?
Well, two reasons. One, this started, Mike knew I had a sabre background, and he knew that I was interested in sword and buckler. So he asked me if I'd help him and basically just be there for him to hit on, right? It's like, yeah, sure, it sounds like fun. But it really is fun. And the more I saw, the more we were working on that and watching his process of, you know, it's so difficult because he has several contacts in Georgia, some of whom live in the US now, who studied with some of the men who were the last to really use the system. And so there's a lot of conversation back and forth, and Mike would shoot video and he'd send it to these men and say, okay, is this close? And they say, well, this part's right, but maybe tweak this. And so we were always going back and retrying this. And in the process, you know, I still am very much just there to help, you know, but it's been really interesting to me to see the difference between both the way this is taught, the way it was used, and say, you know, the Walpurgis manuscript, which I think was very good. But the best I can tell, when you look at, you know, I-33, it's maybe a lecture notes. They're sort of condensed. We have some images, we have some description, some in Latin, some in German, but there's no, you know, and it's clearly part of a complete system, but we don't have all that information. And from what I understand from Mike and from Bakhtin and a few other people, the way that the Georgians taught this was much more organic. kids would start playing with wooden sticks, a little wooden pottery, and they would sort of start playing, and the adults might say, hey, try this. So by the time they're old enough to be fighting, they're pretty formidable. And they've sort of learned this through play, and they've learned this through their whole village sort of helping them out. And that's fascinating to me, because I was trained so formally in martial arts that the idea of doing this in a much more, holistic, organic, kind of tribal way was just really fascinating to me. And the accounts of the Georgians they were formidable warriors. They were very effective. And I have to say too, watching Bolognese, Lichtenauer, not Lichtenauer, it's I forget the guy. It's one of the German systems that does sword and buckler, and the Walpurgis. Of those that I've seen, I think Georgian would hold its own very well against them. Somebody understands it well.
Very interesting. Could you tell us a bit about your martial arts background? What kind of martial arts you started with?
Sure. I don't remember my first lesson. My father tells me I was 3 and having trouble with some kid on the street. So he taught me a few things, and that took care of the problem, apparently. But my father was my first teacher. He learned martial arts in the army. He'd been in Korea for a while and started Mudokan there. And when I was, I think, 11, maybe 10, I started formal training in a very related field. I was living in DC at the time, and so one of the big schools there was Jun Ree's system. And he had a lot of really good coaches. I worked mostly with Jeff Smith, who had been a heavyweight champion, and a couple other coaches, and I loved it. I spent 3 days a week at least training, and I think as a young person it was really healthy for me. It was also a time when competition wise we didn't have a lot of the padding that like my kids that do when they do it today. So by the age of 14 I'd had some pretty nasty injuries, but I learned a lot doing it. And so from there I stayed in Taekwondo sort of in that area for a long time, and then I started studying Kendo for a short time when I was in DC the second time. And when I came back to the West Coast, there's a Taekwondo master I know here who's very good, and he actually started out in Gumdo. And so we were doing some of the Korean sword forms that are related to Kendo, although I don't say that to him because he gets very upset. But, and then we also, from that, I rolled into some study of Tai Chi for about 2 years, mostly Yang style, and then some of the broadsword forms. Which was good. I was recuperating from an injury, and so it was much kinder of me.
And why did you make this transition to European swords and swordsmanship?
That's a good question. I've always wanted to try fencing even when I was little, and I actually started fencing in high school. So I started fencing foil in 1987, and I did that for about a year, and then the man who was teaching it had some family commitments and stopped. And so I was in for about the next year or two trying to find a place to go and fencing whenever I could, but I didn't have a lot of formal instruction around 90. And then when I transferred universities, they had a really good fencing club there, and it's close to Los Angeles, which has a lot of fencing Maestro. So I was able to get really good lessons. And I competed there for several years, and I've sort of done them side by side, partly because, like I said earlier, I think each of those informs our view of things. And so I don't want to ignore them, a tradition, if it might help me understand some of the universal principles behind all of them. And I think that's one of the things it's been the most successful for, is that, I recognize that there are distinct differences, say, between Western fencing and Japanese, Kendo or one of the Ryu. But that said, a lot of the problem solving may have different solutions, but they have the same problems. How do I protect my head? How do I keep distance? What timing does this have to happen in? And so I think the more time we spend with those principles and trying to work around them and figure them out with different tools, different systems, the more we appreciate those principles and can apply them, with our base weapon. And I've found that true for like the time I've spent with Fiore and some of the other systems. I'm a lot less uncomfortable grappling than I used to be. And traditionally for me, I'm like, why would I grapple? I have 3 feet of steel, keep them over there, you know. But I now recognize how that was a part of the system, even to a very late period with broadsword. So, yeah, but
could you please tell us how did you get that recognition that grappling is important?
Well, you know, one of the things I was told growing up is that if something is bothering you, if you're uncomfortable with it, you probably need to think about that for a bit. And one of the fights I lost in elementary school was to a wrestler. And, you know, it's just the way things happen on a playground, of course, but, you know, I was getting ready to punch and kick him and he just dropped and took my legs out. Next thing I know, I'm in the gravel with my face down. And that was the end of the fight. I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, well, I can't get up. I don't know how to get out of this. And so from that point on, whenever I got into trouble, I was always very quick to avoid any kind of grappling, because I thought if they get close to me, I'm in trouble. And my system didn't do a lot of that. So I recognized this is something I need to fix. And you know, I've known a lot of wrestlers of different types, and grapplers, especially in Fiore and some of the other things. And so that was kind of where I thought, okay, I'll start learning this now. But there's still that part of my brain that thinks I have a weapon. Why would I wrestle? But then if you use the weapon, you're going to need to do something. And I do, you know, I don't think there's much disagreement, but wrestling seems to be the foundation for so many of these martial arts. You know, there's wrestling and then they build from there. So like with Fiore, again, whatever you see with pole arms or longsword has an analog in grappling. And you may be using the exact same thing that you do as a wrestler, but you've got a weapon as well. And that was a sort of a revelation for me.
So Jim, do you also teach longsword, European longsword?
I don't. I have studied it for a few years. I don't feel qualified to teach it. I'll help like Mike or Alex Spryer demo if they ask me to. But I haven't spent enough time with it, I don't think, to teach it. I wouldn't teach it well. Okay.
Do I understand you in a way that do I feel like that you don't like this weapon that much, or is it?
Oh, no, I like it. Well, I should say, I like what I see in the manuscripts, and I longsword done very, very well.
Yes.
But a lot of the longsword I run into, I feel like, and this may make some people very unhappy, is very late period 16th century Meyer longsword, which is more competition focused.
Yes, it is.
And this makes sense, right? We don't have big steel helmets, we have fencing masks, and a lot of the things from, say, you know, Lichtenauer or Fiore are going to very badly hurt someone if they use the whole system. So it makes sense to use Meyer. I think there's sometimes a discrepancy between competitors who claim to be doing one thing, but really they're doing the other. And I don't have much interest in the competition style of longsword. I'm much more interested in the martial arts application of it. And by definition, that means we can't do a lot of it. So demonstrating it is fine. And in harness, I would do it, although it would be a little silly because you wouldn't be cutting at somebody in full harness. You know, that's when you have sword, right? Which is also very fun. But I don't dislike longsword. I just, I haven't spent enough time with it to feel like I understand it well enough to teach it.
Okay. You know? Could you, Jim, please explain why most people concentrate on Italian swordsmanship and not German swordsmanship in the United States?
You know, that's a fascinating question. Because I honestly don't know if they do, you know?
Oh, okay.
I don't. I mean, but this is a good question. I think about this a lot, because one of the things I've noticed is that Fiore has a bigger following, I think, in the US than the KDF, although there are a lot of really good KDF schools too. But like, you know, there's the team in Chicago, there's Maestro Sean Hayes here in Oregon. Mike obviously started out there, Alex too. I'm not sure. My guess would be, if I had to guess, that despite the fact that a lot of American like sport and traditional fencing was French influenced, there was a pretty sizable Italian influx in the early 20th century. And so like the school that I learned from was a mixed school of Italian and Hungarian. And maybe that's why it just feels a little bit more familiar. I really don't know. I think locally, at least in Oregon, most schools are doing Kunstgefechtes. They're not doing Fiore. It tends to stand out more. But you know, and I haven't fenced in Europe, so I don't know how it works there. But my sense is that outside of Italy, no one really worries about Fiore. That's like one group in Poland, maybe.
Yeah.
You know.
Why people don't use Talhofer as often as they use Fiore?
I don't know. And it's a great manuscript.
Yeah,
you know, the images are provocative, to say the least, right? And then there's a little bit of everything in there. I don't know if it's because there's less description, but if they can use, you know, die Zettel, they can use Talhofer, right? I mean, it's less confusing than you know, Lichtenauer's recital. So I like Talhofer. I use them for examples all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know why people do it. And that book's been, they had an edition come out, I think, oh gosh, 20 years ago. So it's been in, you know, in English a long time. So I don't know why people don't use it. It's strange.
Do you, okay, let's go on to other weapons. Do you teach rapier?
I'd say I teach late period rapier. So I actually brought one with me here. So this is called a smara, and it's sort of the Southern Italian thrusting weapon. And you'll notice it looks very much like a rapier, as the cup, the quillons, the pasdan, knuckle bow. And these were in use into the 20th century in the south of Italy. And there are some interesting comments. I think there's one, I want to say it's, I think it was Mazzanello Parise's text has a quotation from the French talking about the disadvantage that they have in competition with the Italians. Now, of course, he's selecting out the part that's going to sound the best. But he says that Italian fencers are using basically the same weapon that they fight duels with, rather than a practice weapon. And so it's basically the same setup, but with a sharp blade. And so whatever they're doing, they don't have to alter that at all. It's an interesting point of view, but it's held very much the same way that a rapier is held, you know, sort of with your fingers. I don't know if you can see this quite the same way. And these just sort of wrap around. And a lot of the techniques are similar. They're just late period. And I've studied quite a bit of rapier. I've taken some, you know, some seminars and things on it, but I don't teach a lot of it.